Alex had always dreamed of living in a peaceful neighborhood. After years of renting apartments with noisy neighbors and old plumbing problems, the thought of owning a house with a small yard and quiet streets filled with trees felt like a dream come true. Finally, Alex found a charming house with a neat little garden in the front and enough space in the backyard to plant vegetables and flowers. It was everything Alex had imagined and more. Moving day was filled with excitement, and for the first few weeks life seemed perfect. The neighbors waved from across the street. Children played on the sidewalks, and the only sound Alex could hear at night was the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of leaves in the wind. It didn't take long, however, for Alex to notice something unusual about the neighborhood. Along with the welcoming environment came a strict homeowners association, commonly known as the HOA. At first, it seemed like a good thing. The rules ensured that lawns were kept tidy, houses maintained, and the overall look of the neighborhood was consistent. But soon, Alex discovered that the HOA's rules were not just about keeping the place nice. They were about control down to the smallest detail. A slightly chipped mailbox or a bush growing just a bit too tall could trigger warnings and fines. Alex began receiving letters almost weekly. One letter complained about a slightly uneven driveway, another about a mailbox color that didn't perfectly match the others, and yet another about a garden gnome that wasn't allowed under HOA rules. Each letter came with a polite tone but a clear expectation: fix the issue immediately or face penalties. At first, Alex tried to comply with every request. Alex trimmed the bushes exactly as specified, repainted the mailbox in the approved shade, and even removed a few decorative items from the yard that were considered non-conforming. But despite all efforts, the letters didn't stop. It became clear that the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were micromanaging every aspect of residents' lives. Friends who came to visit noticed the constant letters and warned Alex that many neighbors felt the same way. Some had even faced large fines for the smallest infractions. Alex began feeling stressed and frustrated. It was one thing to maintain a house and yard, but it was another to constantly feel watched and judged for every decision, however minor. One sunny morning, Alex stepped outside to enjoy a cup of coffee in the front yard. The garden looked perfect. The flowers in full bloom and the solar-powered lights that Alex had installed last summer twinkled faintly in the early light. The little lights had been a small investment, meant to brighten up the garden and add a welcoming touch. They were harmless and even eco-friendly, but that morning another HOA letter arrived in the mailbox. Alex felt a sinking feeling in the stomach before even opening it. The letter complained about the solar lights, claiming they violated the HOA's policy on uniform appearance of the front yard. Alex couldn't believe it. The lights were subtle, not flashy, and didn't bother anyone. But the HOA seemed determined to make a fuss. The letter demanded that Alex remove the lights immediately or face fines, penalties, and possible legal action. Alex read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. How could tiny lights, barely noticeable, be a problem? Was this really the life Alex had signed up for when moving into this peaceful neighborhood? The frustration turned into anger, but also a spark of determination. Alex wasn't going to let an organization dictate every little thing about personal property without question. Over the next few days, Alex observed the neighborhood more closely. Neighbors often whispered about the HOA behind closed doors. Some avoided confrontation entirely, while others had tried to challenge the rules but quickly learned how powerful the HOA could be. Stories circulated about residents being fined hundreds of dollars or forced to remove perfectly fine additions to their homes. Alex realized that the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were asserting control over personal expression, creativity, and comfort. The unfairness of it all grew heavier with each passing day. One evening, Alex decided to take action and learn more about the HOA. There was a monthly meeting scheduled at the community center, and Alex thought attending might be a good first step. Perhaps the board members could be reasoned with. Or maybe there was a way to resolve the issue without escalating it further. Alex prepared notes, took pictures of the yard and lights, and even researched the HOA rules and bylaws. It was important to be fully prepared, and Alex wanted to approach the situation calmly and respectfully, hoping that logic and evidence might sway the board. The meeting day arrived. The community center was filled with residents, some seated quietly, others chatting with neighbors. The board members sat at a long table at the front, reviewing papers and discussing minor neighborhood concerns. When Alex's turn came to speak, the nerves were visible. Alex explained the situation, showing photographs of the lights and highlighting how small and unobtrusive they were. Alex also explained that the lights were eco-friendly and enhanced safety around the house at night. The hope was to appeal to reason, to show that the lights were a positive addition, not a violation, but the board members were unmoved. They insisted that the lights must be removed, citing regulations and uniform appearance policies. Every word spoken by the board seemed rigid, inflexible, and dismissive. Alex tried to reason further, pointing out that similar lights existed in other homes and that no one had complained about them. Still, the board remained firm. The tone of the meeting left Alex frustrated and a little disheartened. It was clear that logic alone would not solve this problem. Walking back to the house that evening, Alex's mind raced. There had to be a way to address the issue without simply giving in or escalating into months of legal battles. The frustration was turning into determination, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to stand up to the HOA without breaking the rules. Alex started thinking creatively, imagining small, clever ways to make a point while staying completely within the law. The idea of doing something subtle but undeniable began to take shape. It wouldn't be about confrontation, but about showing that fairness and common sense mattered too. Alex spent the next few days reading every document related to the HOA rules, looking for loopholes or areas that were vaguely defined. It was like studying a puzzle, and each small detail could make a difference. As Alex pieced together the rules, it became clear that there were ways to comply technically, while still challenging the spirit of the overbearing regulations. It was the perfect opportunity for a clever response, one that would be both safe and effective. During this time, Alex's neighbors began noticing a change too. Alex smiled at them more warmly, exchanged nods, and shared subtle hints that something was about to change. Some neighbors were curious, some skeptical, and some quietly supportive. Word about Alex's struggle with the HOA spread quietly through the neighborhood. People who had felt powerless themselves began to feel a sense of hope, seeing that someone was willing to take a stand without causing unnecessary conflict. Alex also took time to enjoy the little things in the yard, to reconnect with the simple joys of owning a home. Tending to the flowers, watching the sunlight reflect off the leaves, and sitting quietly with a cup of coffee each morning reminded Alex why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about solar lights, it was about personal freedom, creativity, and the right to make a home feel like a home. Every small decision mattered, and Alex was determined to make the point without causing chaos. By the end of the first part of this journey, Alex was ready. The research was done, the ideas were forming, and a plan was slowly taking shape in the mind. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be aggressive, but it would be clever, effective, and undeniable. Alex knew that the path ahead would require patience, attention to detail, and a careful balance of respect and assertiveness. But for the first time in weeks, there was a spark of excitement. This wasn't just about fighting an unfair rule. It was about proving that a little creativity, intelligence, and courage could stand up to control without causing harm. And so, with a quiet determination, Alex looked out at the small yard, the twinkling solar lights, and the peaceful street beyond. A plan was forming, one that would not only respond to the HOA but also inspire neighbors, challenge unreasonable authority, and ultimately bring a sense of pride and freedom back to the community. The journey was just beginning, and Alex was ready to face it head-on, armed with patience, wit, and the belief that fairness and creativity could overcome even the strictest rules. After the meeting, Alex felt a mix of frustration and determination. The board members had been cold and rigid, refusing to listen to reason, but Alex didn't want to give up. Walking back home, the sun setting behind the trees, Alex thought about the neighborhood and the people who lived there. Most of the neighbors were friendly, kind, and hardworking, yet they lived under the constant pressure of the HOA. Alex realized that the problem wasn't just about the lights. It was about the rules controlling every little part of their lives and the way people felt powerless. Alex began visiting neighbors more, talking quietly and respectfully to those who were willing to share their experiences. They whispered stories of being fined for minor infractions, a slightly crooked garden statue, a colorful welcome mat, or even hanging laundry outside instead of using an approved drying rack. Some neighbors had tried to appeal decisions, but the HOA board was stubborn, often dismissing their concerns without proper consideration. Listening to these stories, Alex felt a growing sense of purpose. It wasn't just about one person fighting the board. It was about standing up for fairness, creativity, and the right to make a home feel personal. The following days, Alex devoted time to understanding the HOA rules more thoroughly. Reading every line, cross-referencing bylaws, and noting exceptions became a daily routine. It was tedious work, but Alex approached it like a puzzle. Each paragraph, each phrase, held the potential to reveal a loophole, a detail that could be used to respond cleverly. By night, Alex would sit at the desk with a cup of tea, highlighting passages, making notes, and imagining possible solutions. The goal wasn't to break the rules, but to interpret them in a way that allowed for creativity and self-expression, without risk of penalties. One evening, Alex started brainstorming ideas for a subtle, clever way to respond to the solar light issue. The plan had to be safe, legal, and effective. Alex imagined installing lights that were technically allowed but would make the point that strict control over small details was unreasonable. The lights could be arranged in a creative pattern that was visible but did not violate any code. They could be eco-friendly, sustainable, and even useful for safety. Most importantly, they would highlight the absurdity of the rigid rules while remaining completely compliant. Neighbors started noticing Alex's efforts around the house. While some were curious, others were quietly supportive. People would wave or stop for a chat, asking about the garden, the plants, or the subtle changes being made. Alex would smile and respond politely, careful not to reveal the plan too early. The quiet support of neighbors gave Alex encouragement. It was reassuring to know that others felt the same frustrations and were quietly cheering for change. Meanwhile, the HOA continued its routine of sending letters and reminders. Alex received another notice regarding a tiny imperfection in the backyard path. While some might have been discouraged, Alex viewed it as confirmation that the approach needed to be both clever and firm. The goal was not confrontation but demonstration, showing that it was possible to follow the rules while still expressing personal creativity. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience and precision. Alex began making small adjustments in the yard. Plants were arranged in neat patterns, decorative stones placed strategically, and subtle lighting tested for visibility. Every change was documented carefully. Photos were taken to prove compliance, and every detail was cross-checked against HOA guidelines. The process was slow and meticulous, but Alex enjoyed it. Each small step was part of a larger plan, and watching the yard slowly transform into a more creative and welcoming space was satisfying. While working in the yard, Alex often thought about the psychology of the HOA board. Why were they so strict? Why did they focus on control instead of community? It became clear that the board valued conformity over creativity, and that their idea of order was often at odds with the happiness of residents. Understanding this mindset helped Alex craft a strategy that would be effective. The plan needed to comply with the rules while subtly highlighting the rigidity and absurdity of the board's decisions. One afternoon, a neighbor named Mr. Thompson stopped by for a chat. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had seen countless disputes with the HOA. Alex listened intently as Mr. Thompson recounted stories of fines, disagreements, and frustration. Then, leaning slightly closer, he said with a chuckle, "You know, the HOA hates when anyone thinks for themselves. Just do something smart and clever and you'll see how they react. They have no idea how to handle it." Those words stayed with Alex. It wasn't about being rebellious or rude. It was about being clever, following the rules, and showing that fairness mattered. Alex felt more confident. The plan was taking shape and the goal was clear: respond to the HOA in a way that was respectful, legal, and undeniable. Late nights became part of the routine. Alex would sketch ideas for the yard layout, test lighting arrangements, and consider how each element would appear from the street. Small solar lights were repositioned, plants rearranged, and subtle decorative pieces added. The changes were incremental, almost unnoticeable at first, but gradually the yard began to take on a more personal, creative feel. Alex felt a sense of control returning. It wasn't about defiance. It was about reclaiming the right to make a home feel like a home. As the days went by, Alex also began documenting everything. Notes, photographs, and careful logs of each adjustment created a detailed record. This wasn't just for the HOA, it was for Alex. A way to track progress, maintain focus, and ensure that each step stayed within legal limits. Preparation became a form of empowerment. The meticulous attention to detail reminded Alex that even small actions could have a significant impact. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lights in the yard began to glow, Alex felt a sense of satisfaction. The pattern of lights was subtle, almost playful, and yet it conveyed the idea that creativity and individuality were important. The garden was vibrant, orderly, and beautiful, demonstrating that personal expression could coexist with rules. Alex stepped back, sipping a cup of tea, and felt a quiet thrill. The plan was ready to be revealed in the coming days. Neighbors began noticing subtle changes and commenting quietly. Some admired the arrangement while others seemed curious. A few smiled knowingly, sensing that Alex was quietly challenging the HOA without causing conflict. The sense of community began to shift. People felt more empowered, more willing to consider their own creative touches, and more willing to question the overbearing rules in a calm, thoughtful way. Meanwhile, the HOA continued its usual routine, unaware of the impending surprise. Letters arrived, but Alex remained calm. Every response was polite, professional, and carefully crafted. There was no aggression, only quiet confidence and preparation. Alex knew that when the time came, the response would be effective and undeniable, showing that fairness, logic, and creativity could stand up to overreach without breaking rules or causing harm. The first part of the plan had been research and preparation. The second part was careful implementation and observation. Alex had laid the groundwork, understood the rules, documented every detail, and slowly transformed the yard into a space that balanced creativity and compliance. Patience was key, and every small step had been taken thoughtfully. The tension of living under strict HOA oversight had not diminished, but Alex had gained something far more valuable, a sense of empowerment and purpose. As the days turned into weeks, Alex felt a quiet anticipation. The moment to reveal the clever response to the HOA was approaching, and the excitement was palpable. Every detail, every carefully placed light, and every subtle change was part of a plan that would not only address the issue with the solar lights but also inspire neighbors and subtly challenge the rigid rules. Alex spent time imagining the reaction of the board, the quiet smiles of supportive neighbors, and the eventual realization that fairness and creativity could triumph without aggression. The process was more than just a response to a letter. It was a demonstration of intelligence, patience, and the belief that standing up for what is right could be done thoughtfully and effectively. By the end of this stage, Alex was ready. The foundation had been built, the strategy refined, and the tools prepared. The yard was not only beautiful but symbolic, a quiet statement that individual expression and adherence to rules could coexist. Alex looked at the glowing lights one evening, feeling a sense of calm confidence. The next phase would be about revealing the surprise, testing the response of the HOA, and quietly showing that cleverness and persistence could overcome overreach. The story of the neighborhood, the residents, and the quiet but determined fight against unnecessary control was only beginning to unfold, and Alex was prepared for the journey ahead. The day Alex decided to begin the next phase of the plan arrived quietly, without fanfare. Early in the morning, Alex stepped outside into the soft light of dawn, coffee in hand, and looked around the yard. Everything was in place. The plants were neatly arranged, the decorative stones in carefully planned positions, and the solar lights ready to be activated in a creative, subtle pattern. Every detail had been checked multiple times against HOA guidelines. The time had come to turn preparation into action. Alex began installing the lights in the final configuration, making sure that the arrangement was visible from the street without being flashy or out of place. The pattern was simple but clever, almost like a secret message or a small piece of art that only observant eyes could fully appreciate. The solar panels were positioned perfectly to ensure that the lights would glow each evening, and a few small signs were added with gentle, inspirational messages, emphasizing creativity, safety, and harmony. Alex wanted the yard to feel welcoming, not confrontational. Neighbors walking by during the day paused to watch. Some whispered to each other, smiling at the subtle beauty of the arrangement. Others stopped to ask Alex about the lights in the garden, curious about the effort being put into something so small, yet carefully designed. Alex explained with a calm smile that the garden was a personal project meant to make the home inviting, improve safety at night, and add beauty to the neighborhood. Every answer was polite and grounded in reason, demonstrating that the project was thoughtful and compliant with the rules. By late afternoon, everything was complete. Alex stepped back to take in the full view of the yard. The solar lights began to glow softly as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The garden seemed to shimmer with life and creativity, each light and plant forming a cohesive, balanced display. Alex felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that the effort, patience, and planning were finally coming to fruition. This was more than just lights. It was a statement of individuality and fairness, presented respectfully and elegantly. As dusk turned to evening, the first neighbors noticed the glowing lights. Their reactions ranged from quiet admiration to subtle nods of approval. Some chuckled softly, appreciating the cleverness of the arrangement. Alex watched from the porch, sipping tea, feeling a quiet pride in the way the neighborhood seemed to respond. It wasn't about proving anything aggressively. It was about showing that creativity, compliance, and personal expression could coexist peacefully. The following morning, the HOA sent another letter, but this time, it had a different tone. They attempted to argue that the arrangement was in violation of some technical guideline, but a careful reading of the bylaws revealed that Alex had done nothing wrong. With detailed photographs, documentation of each step, and a polite but firm explanation, Alex responded to the letter. The response was calm, precise, and backed by evidence, leaving little room for argument. It wasn't aggressive or rude, just confident and logical. The HOA was left without leverage, and the situation highlighted the effectiveness of preparation and careful planning. Word about Alex's approach began to spread quietly among neighbors. People admired the balance between cleverness and respect for the rules. Some started thinking about small creative changes they could make in their own yards, inspired by Alex's example. The quiet empowerment was spreading, showing the community that it was possible to reclaim personal expression without confrontation. Alex realized that the plan was not just about the lights, but about fostering a sense of confidence and creativity in the neighborhood. Days passed, and Alex continued to observe the subtle impact of the changes. People who had once been intimidated by the HOA now smiled more freely while walking by. Others began arranging their gardens in unique ways, adding small personal touches that were still compliant with HOA rules. The neighborhood was gradually transforming, not through rebellion, but through quiet, thoughtful action that respected both the community and the rules. During this time, Alex continued to communicate politely with the HOA. Every letter was carefully written, every rule checked, and every concern addressed with patience and evidence. The goal was never to attack the board, but to demonstrate that fairness and creativity could coexist with rules. Slowly, the board seemed to realize that their rigid approach was being challenged not through anger but through intelligence, patience, and subtle influence. One afternoon, Alex overheard a conversation between two neighbors while tending to the garden. They were discussing the lights and the careful design of the yard. One said, "I can't believe how clever this is. It follows the rules perfectly, but it makes a point without being rude." The other nodded in agreement, adding, "It's inspiring. Makes me want to try something small of my own, just to see what happens." Alex smiled quietly, realizing that the influence of a single thoughtful action was beginning to ripple through the neighborhood. Over the next week, Alex continued fine-tuning the display, adding small touches of color and subtle patterns that enhanced the overall design without crossing any lines. The process became almost meditative, a way to channel frustration into creativity and patience. Each night, as the lights glowed softly, Alex felt a growing sense of accomplishment. The plan was working, not through confrontation, but through careful thought, observation, and strategic action. The community began to feel a subtle shift in power dynamics. Neighbors were no longer entirely intimidated by the HOA. Realizing that compliance and creativity could coexist, they felt empowered to make small, thoughtful changes, and the atmosphere on the streets became lighter, warmer, and more inviting. Alex had started a quiet movement, showing that even in a restrictive environment it was possible to assert individuality, without creating conflict. One evening, a neighbor came by to chat. He complimented Alex on the design and asked how it had been done so carefully within the HOA rules. Alex smiled and explained that it had required patience, attention to detail, and careful planning. The conversation reinforced the idea that intelligence and respect could have a powerful impact, inspiring others to approach problems creatively rather than confrontationally. As the days went by, Alex began receiving informal messages of support from neighbors who had previously remained silent. They expressed gratitude, admiration, and even a quiet sense of pride in the collective subtle defiance. Alex realized that this project had become bigger than just the yard or the lights. It had become a symbol of thoughtful action, community strength, and the ability to reclaim personal expression even under restrictive rules. Meanwhile, the HOA continued its usual routines, sending reminders and notices, but their influence seemed diminished. Alex remained polite and compliant in all correspondence, using each interaction to reinforce the importance of fairness and logic. The board's rigidity was no match for careful planning, evidence, and subtle creative action. Alex's approach demonstrated that true influence came from thoughtfulness, preparation, and quiet confidence rather than aggression or confrontation. One particularly quiet evening, Alex stood on the porch looking at the softly glowing lights. The yard had transformed into a peaceful, welcoming space, a small beacon of creativity and resilience. The street was quiet, but the presence of the yard sent a subtle message. Individual expression and community rules could coexist harmoniously. Alex felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the careful planning and thoughtful action had made a meaningful difference, not only for personal satisfaction but for the neighborhood as a whole. As part 3 of the journey concluded, Alex's quiet strategy had succeeded beyond expectations. The solar lights glowed, the garden looked beautiful, and the neighborhood was beginning to feel a subtle shift toward empowerment and creativity. The HOA's strict control was challenged not through conflict, but through careful, clever, and legal action. The foundation had been laid for further developments, and Alex was ready to see how the next stage of the plan would unfold. The story was moving forward, demonstrating the power of patience, strategy, and quiet ingenuity in transforming a restrictive environment into a space of creativity, freedom, and community strength. As the neighborhood adjusted to Alex's creative yard, the HOA board began to notice subtle changes, though they didn't fully understand the impact. Letters continued to arrive as the board tried to maintain their strict control, but Alex's responses were always calm, polite, and backed with careful documentation. Every step had been planned to remain within the rules, ensuring there was no real grounds for fines or penalties. Alex had discovered that preparation and patience were more powerful than anger or confrontation. The HOA letters became less threatening, as their authority was quietly challenged through intelligence and subtle action. Neighbors started to act in small ways, inspired by Alex's approach. One family added a small flower bed with tiny solar lights along the edge of their walkway, carefully following the HOA's specifications. Another placed a colorful welcome mat within the allowed design standards. The quiet influence of Alex's yard had spread, creating a sense of empowerment. People began to see that they could maintain compliance while expressing personality and creativity, and this shifted the dynamic of the neighborhood. The rigid authority of the HOA was starting to feel less intimidating. Alex's days were filled with observation, small adjustments, and strategic communication. Each letter from the HOA was met with polite responses that included photographs and precise references to the bylaws. Alex never challenged the board aggressively. Instead, the responses highlighted fairness, logic, and adherence to the rules. Slowly, the board's power began to wane, not because of rebellion, but because they had no legal grounds to enforce their overreach. Alex's careful planning and strategy had created a quiet but undeniable shift. Late one afternoon, Alex noticed a few board members walking slowly past the yard, their expressions a mixture of confusion and curiosity. They paused briefly, examining the solar lights, the garden patterns, and the subtle decorative touches. Alex didn't approach them but observed quietly from a distance. It was clear they were unsure how to handle the situation. The yard complied with every rule, yet it boldly displayed creativity and personal expression. The HOA's usual method of control was ineffective against thoughtful, intelligent action. As the week progressed, more neighbors began adding subtle personal touches to their own properties. A few hung bird feeders carefully placed to meet HOA height guidelines. Others painted small garden statues in muted colors still within compliance. Alex noticed these changes during morning walks and evening coffee breaks. The street, once uniform and predictable, was gradually taking on a new energy. People seemed more confident, proud of their small contributions, and no longer afraid of being criticized for minor creative choices. During this time, Alex began documenting the transformation. Photographs were taken, notes written, and small logs maintained. These records served multiple purposes. They tracked the neighborhood's subtle changes, provided evidence of compliance, and allowed Alex to observe the effect of strategic action over time. This careful record-keeping was part of the plan to show that clever, thoughtful decisions could challenge unnecessary control while remaining within legal boundaries. One morning, Alex noticed a child stopping to admire the solar lights. The child pointed to the glowing pattern and whispered to a parent, "Look how pretty it is. I want to make my garden like that." Alex smiled quietly, realizing that the influence of the yard had reached even the youngest residents. Creativity and individuality were beginning to be seen as positive, not risky or rebellious. The neighborhood was subtly learning that personal expression could coexist with the rules without fear of punishment. The HOA sent another letter, attempting to argue a minor technicality. Alex responded promptly with calm professionalism, including detailed photographs showing compliance. The response emphasized respect for the board and the rules, while subtly highlighting the absurdity of overreach. This approach had an impact. The board seemed unsure how to proceed, recognizing that their rigid enforcement had been quietly undermined by patience, preparation, and thoughtful strategy. Alex's influence had become a quiet force of change. In the evenings, Alex would stand on the porch and observe the neighborhood. Streetlights cast gentle shadows and the solar lights glowed softly, illuminating the carefully arranged plants and decorative elements. The peaceful, inviting atmosphere was a stark contrast to the tension that had existed before. Neighbors waved to one another, smiled, and exchanged quiet compliments about their gardens. Alex felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the neighborhood was slowly transforming into a place where individuality and creativity could thrive without confrontation. A few residents approached Alex to ask questions about the yard and the lights. Alex explained the process with patience, emphasizing the importance of careful planning, understanding rules, and observing boundaries. The conversations were empowering for neighbors who had previously felt constrained by the HOA. They began to realize that they could take thoughtful actions to improve their homes and express themselves, all while staying compliant. The quiet shift in confidence and empowerment was becoming tangible. Alex also began considering longer-term effects. The HOA had maintained strict control for years, but a single example of clever, compliant action could inspire ongoing change. The neighborhood was slowly reclaiming some sense of autonomy, learning that respect and intelligence could challenge rigidity more effectively than anger or confrontation. Each small adjustment, each polite response, and each creative choice was part of a larger narrative of empowerment and community growth. One afternoon, while adjusting the placement of a few decorative stones, Alex noticed a new neighbor moving in across the street. The couple waved shyly, clearly curious about the neighborhood's dynamics. Alex smiled and welcomed them warmly, explaining the community's focus on creativity and care within the rules. The couple seemed reassured, grateful to learn that personal expression was possible even under strict oversight. Alex realized that the subtle influence of the yard extended beyond aesthetics. It was teaching neighbors and newcomers alike that intelligence, patience, and respect could create meaningful change. The quiet momentum continued over the following weeks. Neighbors added small touches, careful lighting, and well-arranged plantings. Conversations about the neighborhood's evolving creativity began to appear in casual chats, highlighting the subtle impact of Alex's example. Even those who had been most cautious about the HOA started experimenting with small changes, inspired by the combination of cleverness, patience, and respect demonstrated by Alex. The community's atmosphere shifted from fear of fines to pride in thoughtful, compliant creativity. Throughout this process, Alex maintained meticulous attention to detail. Every new addition, every adjustment, and every interaction with neighbors and the HOA was approached with thoughtfulness and care. The goal was never to provoke conflict, but to demonstrate that fairness, logic, and creativity could coexist. Alex's example showed that change was possible even in a restrictive environment, without aggression or rule-breaking. The neighborhood was quietly transforming, and the effects were becoming more visible each day. One evening, Alex observed the solar lights glowing softly as neighbors walked past, exchanging smiles and compliments. The street had taken on a new energy, a sense of quiet pride and shared creativity. It was a small revolution, not through loud protests or confrontations, but through intelligence, preparation, and thoughtful action. Alex felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the community was beginning to embrace individuality while respecting the rules. As Part 4 came to a close, the neighborhood had subtly but clearly changed. The influence of Alex's thoughtful, clever approach was evident in the increased confidence of residents. The small creative touches appearing throughout the community, and the gradual realization by the HOA that their rigid enforcement could be challenged without breaking any rules. The story was moving toward its final stage, with the groundwork laid for the ultimate demonstration of clever, respectful, and undeniable action. Alex had shown that patience, intelligence, and careful planning could create meaningful change, inspire a community, and quietly challenge unnecessary control, all while maintaining harmony and respect. The final stage of Alex's plan unfolded quietly but powerfully. The neighborhood had gradually transformed, with more residents adding personal touches to their yards, all while remaining compliant with HOA rules. The solar lights in Alex's yard glowed softly each evening, casting a welcoming and peaceful ambiance over the street. What had begun as a personal effort to challenge an overbearing HOA had turned into a small movement, inspiring neighbors to reclaim their creative freedom in subtle, thoughtful ways. One afternoon, Alex received another letter from the HOA. This time, the tone was noticeably different. The board seemed uncertain, as though they were unsure how to proceed. Alex read the letter carefully and smiled quietly. It was clear that the quiet, clever strategy had worked. Every previous response had been polite, evidence-based, and fully compliant, leaving the board without grounds to escalate. Alex replied with the same calm professionalism, emphasizing respect for the rules and a commitment to the community's beauty, while subtly reinforcing the idea that creativity and individuality could coexist with regulation. Neighbors continued to observe Alex's yard, often pausing to admire the subtle patterns of lights and decorative elements. Many whispered to one another about how inspiring it was to see such thoughtful creativity within the rules. Others quietly started planning small improvements to their own homes, taking inspiration from Alex's approach. A sense of confidence was spreading through the neighborhood. People were beginning to realize that they could reclaim their personal space and make their homes reflect their personalities without fear of unnecessary punishment. As the days passed, Alex continued small adjustments to the garden and lighting, making sure each element enhanced the overall aesthetic without violating any regulations. Each night, as the solar lights glowed, Alex would stand on the porch, observing neighbors walk by and quietly discuss the changes. The street, once uniform and predictable, had gained warmth, charm, and personality. Even those who had previously been cautious or hesitant began experimenting with subtle creative touches, inspired by the success of Alex's thoughtful strategy. The HOA, now clearly aware that their authority could not be enforced as aggressively without looking unreasonable, began to scale back their strict oversight. Letters became less frequent and less threatening. The board members seemed to realize that the neighborhood's creativity and compliance could coexist peacefully, and that enforcement of trivial infractions no longer held the power it once did. Alex had managed to achieve change without confrontation, demonstrating the strength of patience, careful planning, and clever strategy. One evening, a few neighbors gathered near Alex's yard, admiring the glowing lights and the orderly but creative garden. They shared stories of their own small changes: flower beds, decorative stones, and bird feeders carefully placed to meet HOA guidelines. They spoke quietly about how Alex's example had inspired them to reclaim a sense of personal expression. Alex listened, smiling quietly, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. What had begun as a personal fight had grown into a shared experience, a movement of empowerment that respected rules while reclaiming individuality. Alex reflected on the journey from the first frustrating letter about solar lights to this moment of quiet triumph. It had not been easy. The careful research, meticulous planning, and patient observation had required time, energy, and attention to detail. But the result was worth every effort. The neighborhood had shifted, not through conflict or rebellion, but through intelligence, creativity, and respect. The lights, plants, and subtle decorative touches had become symbols of thoughtful empowerment, visible to all who walked the street. A few weeks later, during a casual stroll, Alex noticed a new family moving in. They paused in front of the yard, looking around with curiosity and admiration. Alex welcomed them warmly, explaining how creativity and compliance could coexist. The family seemed reassured and inspired, grateful to learn that they could personalize their space without fear. This moment reminded Alex that the impact of the plan extended beyond the immediate residents. It was creating a lasting culture of thoughtful action and empowered individuality. As the sun set, casting golden light over the quiet street, Alex took a moment to reflect. The journey had been about more than solar lights or garden patterns. It had been about standing up to unnecessary control with intelligence, patience, and creativity. It had been about showing neighbors that they could assert their individuality without conflict, reclaim their personal spaces, and inspire others to do the same. The quiet power of thoughtful action had transformed the street, the neighborhood, and even the mindset of the HOA. Even the children in the neighborhood noticed the changes. They pointed out the glowing patterns in the yard, admired the colors and arrangements, and whispered to their parents about how pretty and interesting everything looked. Alex realized that these small moments were important. They were teaching the next generation the value of creativity, patience, and clever thinking. The influence of thoughtful action was spreading subtly but meaningfully, leaving a positive impact that went beyond any one house. Neighbors began to take pride in their homes and yards, making small improvements and subtle decorations that reflected their personalities while following the rules. Conversations became more positive, smiles more frequent, and the overall atmosphere lighter and more welcoming. Alex watched from the porch, feeling a quiet joy in knowing that a simple act of creativity and careful planning had fostered community growth, respect, and empowerment. The HOA, observing these subtle changes, seemed to adjust their approach. The board members were less confrontational, perhaps realizing that enforcing every trivial rule was not effective. Alex's calm, thoughtful, and clever strategy had created a shift in dynamics, proving that patience, intelligence, and respect could achieve what aggression and rigidity could not. The neighborhood had found a balance, demonstrating that individuality and compliance could coexist harmoniously. One evening, as the solar lights glowed softly, Alex reflected on the journey from frustration to empowerment. The path had required patience, strategic thinking, and careful planning, but it had created a meaningful impact. The neighborhood was no longer controlled solely by fear of fines or strict rules. Instead, it had become a place where personal expression, creativity, and community pride could flourish. Alex felt a sense of quiet satisfaction knowing that the efforts had not only solved a personal problem but had inspired change and growth in the community. The final weeks of the project were spent fine-tuning and observing the subtle impact. Every light, plant, and decorative element contributed to a balanced and welcoming atmosphere. Neighbors continued to add their own touches inspired by Alex's example. The solar lights remained a quiet but powerful symbol of thoughtful action, creativity, and empowerment. They reminded everyone that standing up for what is fair could be done with intelligence, respect, and patience. As the story of Alex's journey came to a close, the neighborhood had transformed into a vibrant, welcoming, and empowered community. The streets glowed softly at night, filled with thoughtful arrangements of plants and lights, a testament to the power of careful planning, patience, and creative problem-solving. Residents had quietly reclaimed personal expression, and the HOA had learned that respect and compliance could coexist with individuality. Alex's clever, non-confrontational approach had left a lasting impact, showing that even in restrictive environments, intelligence, creativity, and perseverance could create meaningful change, inspire others, and transform a community for the better. Even after the quiet success against the HOA, Alex found that life in the neighborhood was still full of small surprises and challenges. The yard had become a local landmark of creativity and thoughtful action, but it also attracted attention in ways that Alex hadn't fully anticipated. People from nearby streets began walking by, quietly admiring the clever patterns of lights and subtle garden arrangements. Some asked questions about how the project had been planned and implemented. Alex was always willing to answer politely, sharing lessons about patience, careful observation, and creativity without challenging authority unnecessarily. It became clear that the story of the yard was spreading. A few neighbors mentioned that the HOA had started receiving calls from curious people, wanting to know about Alex's approach. The board had no reason to interfere because every action was fully compliant, yet there was a quiet ripple effect of curiosity, respect, and inspiration. Alex realized that the power of a single, thoughtful act could extend beyond immediate surroundings and influence the larger community in subtle but meaningful ways. Despite the success, Alex remained vigilant. The HOA occasionally sent letters, not because there was a violation but as a way to assert presence. Alex continued to respond with calm, detailed explanations, reinforcing that the yard and its features were fully compliant with regulations. Each interaction strengthened Alex's understanding of careful communication, patience, and strategic planning. By documenting every change, every step, and every response, Alex maintained a strong foundation for handling any future challenge. Neighbors who had been hesitant or shy began to approach Alex for advice on subtle improvements to their own properties. Small garden projects, creative yet rule-compliant lighting arrangements, and carefully placed decorative touches began to appear throughout the neighborhood. Alex offered guidance, emphasizing the importance of patience, attention to detail, and creative thinking. Residents were learning that it was possible to assert individuality without causing conflict, and that clever planning often had more impact than confrontation. One weekend, Alex decided to organize a small gathering to celebrate the quiet transformation of the street. The idea was simple: a few chairs, a table with snacks, and an opportunity for neighbors to meet, exchange stories, and quietly recognize the changes that had occurred. Invitations were informal, delivered door to door. The gathering was not about defiance or politics, but about connection, community, and shared appreciation for thoughtful action. It was a reflection of the values that had guided Alex's efforts from the beginning. On the day of the gathering, a dozen or so neighbors arrived, curious and enthusiastic. Conversations flowed easily, with people sharing their experiences, challenges, and small successes in personalizing their yards while respecting HOA rules. Some laughed about past frustrations, while others admired the cleverness of Alex's approach. It was clear that the sense of empowerment had spread beyond a single household. The quiet influence of thoughtful action had encouraged a community-wide shift in mindset, one that emphasized patience, creativity, and compliance without fear. During the gathering, a young couple approached Alex to ask detailed questions about the yard lights. They wanted to implement similar ideas in their own garden, but were worried about violating HOA rules. Alex patiently explained how careful planning, documentation, and attention to the details of the regulations allowed them to make creative choices while remaining compliant. The couple left inspired and confident, eager to try their own small changes. Moments like these reinforced Alex's sense that the project had become more than a personal challenge. It was now a subtle catalyst for broader community growth. As weeks turned into months, the street began to take on a distinct personality. Each home reflected subtle touches of individuality, carefully thought out and within the limits of the HOA guidelines. The solar lights in Alex's yard remained a central feature, glowing gently in the evening and symbolizing careful strategy, creativity, and quiet influence. Alex took pride in seeing how neighbors had embraced the principles of thoughtful planning and creative expression without provoking conflict. The neighborhood had transformed into a place where compliance and individuality could coexist harmoniously. Despite the positive changes, Alex remained mindful of potential challenges. Occasionally there were minor misunderstandings or questions from the HOA, but each was addressed calmly and clearly. By responding with patience, careful documentation, and respect for both the rules and the community, Alex ensured that the HOA could not escalate disputes. The strategy of quiet, intelligent action continued to demonstrate its effectiveness, reinforcing that persistence, clever planning, and respect could achieve results where confrontation could fail.